Hello, I'm Nana Sajaia, and on behalf of the Center for Russia Studies, welcome to this series of interviews on Russia. Today, we'll be speaking with David Setter, a well-known journalist and a Russia scholar. He spent 30 years of his life covering Soviet Union and Russia for the Western media. And in 2013, David became the first Western journalist to be expelled from Russia since the end of the Cold War. Since then, he wrote a couple books about Russia that we will discuss in our conversation. Thank you very much, David, for finding time for this conversation. Very pleased to host you. Let's begin our conversation with your books that you dedicated to the Soviet Union and Russia. As a reader, I find it fascinating not only how you tell untold stories of brutalities and suffering under the Soviet Union, but also your unique ability to come up with the catchy headlines. From "it was a long time ago and it never happened anyway," to "the less you know, better you sleep," to "never speak to strangers." So let's begin with headlines. How do you come up with such titles?
I love Russian proverbs, and I love Russian folk sayings and Russian expressions. And of course, I liked these expressions long before I actually wrote even my first book. But they were in my mind and in my kind of cultural vocabulary for a long time. So when I began writing books, I had a reserve of sayings and expressions from which I could choose. I'm glad that you like the titles of the books, but the reality is, of course, that I'm not the author. I just chose what I thought were the most appropriate Russian sayings and used them as the titles of my books.
As somebody who's been following Russia for such a long time, how do you explain that till today, so many people in Russia mourn the past, that so many people still regard the Soviet Union as something good, even though people were deprived of their fundamental rights?
No, I think there were two reasons. One is the general imperialist mentality that it was inculcated in Russia over centuries. The idea that Russians should be part of a great and threatening state, which makes other countries afraid. This idea didn't begin with the communist period. It existed. I mean, we find quotes from Nicholas I, in which he said that the point is to make the nations of the world fear us. I was once standing in a line in Moscow at a store in a long queue, and one of the people in the queue, a man, started shouting, "How long can we stand in these lines?" And a woman turned to him and said, "Never mind, the whole world is afraid of us." And that, in a way, summarizes the mentality that existed in Russia and still does exist. Russia should be fearsome. It should be a great, powerful state. It should make other countries afraid. And at the same time, ordinary Russians and other Soviet citizens got used to a situation in which they didn't have to think about anything. You might assume that that was a problem for people, to be told what to think. But the reality is many people want nothing more than to be told what to think and to have all decisions made for them and to be taken care of. It's a sad thing, but this is really true about people. The number of people who value their individuality, who want to think for themselves, who have a moral conscience, is actually rather small. It's very easy to turn people into a herd and to take care of them and satisfy all their needs as they understand them on condition that they simply obey. Now, it might seem that that's a bad bargain, but for many people, it's It's a bargain that they're happy to make. So the result is that when people were thrown into a new situation in which suddenly the world was no longer afraid of Russia, and those people who were told what to think suddenly faced a situation in which they had to act and think on their own, of course, there was enormous nostalgia for the days when everything was explained, everything was assured, and no amount of freedom was necessary.
So last year, according to Levada Center's public opinion polls, 75% of Russians said that the Soviet era was the greatest time in their entire history. How do you explain that?
For one thing, the nationalism in Russia did not disappear. Despite all of the hardships of the 1990s, or maybe even because of those hardships, people developed a strong nostalgia for the days when Russia was a great power, and the opinion of Russia was felt in every corner of the world. Now, of course, the economic conditions in Russia are better than they were in the 1990s. Many people have adapted to a capitalist economy and have demonstrated the ability to act and think on their own, at least when it comes to making economic decisions. But that nostalgia for great power, for the ability to influence world events and even dictate world events, that hasn't disappeared. And in fact, it never disappeared entirely. And that has come again to the surface in Russia. And we saw it very much with the events in Georgia in 2008 and the events in Ukraine in 2013. In both cases, Russian aggression had the immediate effect of strengthening the popularity of the rulers. And to a certain extent, the same can be said for the intervention in Syria. The Russian, to a really terrible degree, foreign policy in Russia and war is dictated by internal considerations. This is a way of reinforcing the popularity of those who are in power. The most flagrant example of this was, of course, the first Chechen War, in which Yeltsin's aides said openly that Yeltsin needs a brief victorious war in order to raise his popularity. It didn't seem to occur to anyone that that is an unacceptable reason to start a war. But nonetheless, this was said, and it was said frankly and openly.
Your next book, The Less You Know, Better You Sleep, happens under Yeltsin Presidency, which at large was considered as a democracy. And yet you tell the stories of apartment buildings. How did it happen that West overlooked Yeltsin's undemocratic moves?
Well, I think there are several reasons, but the most important one is that people were frightened by the implications. The people in power in the West, they had information that the apartment bombings were very suspicious. I know this because I filed Freedom of Information Act requests for information about the bombings, and I received State Department documents which showed they were informed about the suspicious nature of these bombings, and particularly the suspicious nature of the incident in Ryazan, where a bomb was found in the basement of a building and was defused before it could explode. These people in power had to consider what would be the implications of speaking openly about what they knew. in this respect, I have a certain amount of understanding for their dilemma. Are they going to expose what happened and risk instability in a nuclear power like Russia? Or did they say nothing and help Russia cover up a terrible crime? Well, they chose the second alternative. And as a result, the media, the academic community, they all followed suit. It took not just a certain amount of courage, but also a leap of imagination to understand that such a thing was really possible. That the leaders of a country who had advertised themselves as Democrats were capable of murdering hundreds of completely random people by blowing up their buildings in the middle of the night, killing them as they slept. This is, that kind of evil is hard for a normal person to grasp. And of course, there was no incentive to grasp it. Inside of Russia, when people began to investigate, one by one, they were killed. Sergei Yushchenkov, Yuri Shekhatchik, Alexander Litvinenko, Anna Politkovskaya. It's a long list. So under these conditions, silence descended over what was in fact the most pivotal event in modern Russian history, because it consolidated the criminal regime that had been created by Yeltsin and created the conditions for the dictatorship that has been imposed by Putin. But the history of this event needs to be discussed, not just for the future of Western countries who are obliged to understand what's going on, but also for Russians themselves, so that they have a sense of their own history. If there's no exposure of the apartment buildings, there's no democratic future for Russia, because this successful provocation will be an example of how power should change hands in the future. And provocation will become the normal means through which people seize and consolidate power in Russia. And that's dangerous for everyone. And it cuts off Russia's potential positive development.
To those who have not read your book, walk us through what happened. How did you come to a conclusion that apartment bombings were orchestrated not by Chechens, but were orchestrated within the intelligence community of Russia?
Well, first of all, the bombings themselves were very, very suspicious and very, very convenient. It appeared that Yeltsin had no chance of naming a successor who could actually win in the 2000 elections. Remember, his popularity rating was 2%, and Putin's popularity rating was 2% when he became prime minister. He was completely unknown, almost completely unknown in Russia. And when he became prime minister, the Russian newspapers ridiculed this choice of Yeltsin. As you know, no one could Yeltsin had gone through 5 prime ministers. This was the 5th. And he seemed to be the most undistinguished of all of them. And the press said that. But then the situation was completely transformed by those bombings.
You speak a great deal about understanding and knowing history. It's not that we don't know enough about history or we have no information about the brutalities and atrocities of the Soviet Union. From Solzhenitsyn to Anne Applebaum to Svetlana Alexievich, fiction or nonfiction, there has been much written and told about life under the Soviet regime. So, in your opinion, knowing less, is it a choice in Russia?
I would not say that there is a lack of knowledge about the atrocities of the Soviet period in the Soviet Union. In fact, as far as I know, Archipelago Gulag is even being taught in the schools. But people are unwilling to draw the proper conclusions. This is the difficulty. What kind of regime was capable of such atrocities against its own people? What does that mean about the future of democracy in Russia and the necessity of democracy in Russia? And when the American founding fathers created the American Constitution and the American federal system, their first concern was to protect against tyranny. In Russia, that priority never really existed. There was always something much more important than guaranteeing the democratic rights of the population. Some political objective, whatever it happened to be, whether it was freeing the proletariat or advancing the cause of capitalism, it didn't really matter. But whatever it was always far more important than the rule of law, than democratic processes, than the separation of powers. I mean, in 1993, Yeltsin sent tanks to attack the parliament. That gives you an idea of what the level of democratic consciousness in Russia. And even with a certain amount of knowledge of past atrocities, Russians are still either unable or unwilling to draw the conclusion that the uncontrolled power of the state historically in Russia and in the present day is the source of their suffering. Once they put two and two together, and use the evidence of the historical record, then Russia will be in a position to make progress in the direction of democracy, but not until then.
And your another book, Never Speak to Strangers. I was going through reviews and came across this sentence. This collection reflects David Setter's 40-year attempt to see them as they are, them Russians. So tell us, what does that mean?
To see them as real people and not to accept, of course, the false version of reality that is put out by the Russian government and by the various Russian regimes. The communist regime, of course, had a completely fictitious view of reality. And according to that view of reality, we didn't have individuals in the Soviet Union. We had builders of communism. The average Soviet citizen had nothing on his mind except building communism. That's how he expressed his individuality, was by supporting the regime. Now, of course, in the post-Soviet era, there is a different collection of myths. But nonetheless, the reality of Russian life needs to be seen for what it is. And that was what I've always tried to do, to tell the story of real people. And that really is the meaning of that phrase. With all of their virtues, their faults, their weaknesses, their strengths, but their true story and their true condition, as opposed to what is being presented and has been presented over the years by various Russian regimes.
And to that extent, do you believe that there are two Russias?
Well, there's the Russia that is presented to the world and the Russia that really exists. All Russian regimes that I've been exposed to, and I've been really exposed to four of them: the Brezhnev regime, the Gorbachev regime, the Yeltsin and the Putin regime, if we personalize them. In all cases, what was presented to the outside world was not what really existed. And so you could say that Russia, no matter who is ruling it, always tries to give the world an impression that doesn't really correspond to the reality of Russian life.
And of course, when we hear the term two Russias, it most often implies the hope that Russia at some point can be a democracy, that Russia can be a reliable partner and a neighbor without ambitions to annex and occupy your lands. Do you believe in that?
No, I think there is hope. Russia is changing. Russia is not static. Russia has a middle class. Russia has many educated people. Russians are able to travel. The conditions exist for Russia to become a more democratic country. The present regime is preserved with corruption, intimidation, and propaganda, and those are not very reliable pillars for maintaining a system for decades. So change may come. The late writer, my friend Vladimir Vinovich, who wrote the Life and Extraordinary Adventures of Sergeant Ivan Chonkin, predicted in the late 1980s, when I was very skeptical, that change was coming to the Soviet Union. And shortly before he died, he said that change is coming to Russia. So he had a good record as far as prophecy is concerned. I hope he's right. The fact is that this regime is not appropriate for a country that is as sophisticated, talented, and cultured as Russia. Russia deserves better and is capable of better. But of course, there are certain necessary conditions. And the first and most fundamental condition is understanding the country's history and truthfully facing the crimes of the past, including the crimes of the post-Soviet period. And most important, recognizing the implications, recognizing that this is the result of the traditional denigration of the individual in Russia and the disregard of human life. We have historical examples, the behavior of Russians during perestroika. After all, the Soviet Union was overthrown in not a bloodless revolution, but a revolution that was basically oriented toward ideas and historical truthfulness. There are examples in history of democratic practices in Russia. The period after the 1905 revolution, up until the Bolshevik seizure of power, was an example of power sharing in Russia. There was a democratic republic in the Far East. It's not out of the question. But of course, there's a special responsibility for Russian intellectuals to face the truth about the past and to draw the necessary implications. Once that's done, then a great deal, I think, can be accomplished.
Thank you very much for your time and an insightful discussion. Let's hope our next discussion will be in person and we'll discuss Russia in Tbilisi.